I think more about how I categorize people in these positions and how other people might categorize me more so than a lot of the other things we talked about previously, or how I label myself and how I think about myself. This optimism or pessimism spectrum feels very influenced by how other people like perceive you and react to you and what they come to you for.
Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar, and this episode is part of a series called Let's Talk About Labels, where we discuss the labels that we have a love-hate relationship with and break down what they really mean for each of us. Now, as always, we'll also share some ways that you can reflect on how they show up in your own life and career. And for this series, I'm inviting my friends to weigh in and share their experience using one of my very favorite ways to communicate, the voice note. I'm bringing on a co-host for this series as well. She's my friend and fellow entrepreneur, Arden Evenson. She's a content creator who advocates for financial inclusion. And when she's not talking about making money, she's talking about making babies, sharing all about her fertility journey online. In these episodes, we're really going to cover it all, from diving into the depths of human behavior to sharing our, hopefully, hilarious hot takes. So without further ado, let's get into the episode.
Okay, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk About Labels. And I'm here with Arden.
Hi, how are we doing today?
We are doing well because I just heard about how you're doing. So I can speak on your behalf that we both have had very productive days, which is like very exciting for two reforming achievers.
Yeah, I always referred to myself in a conversation the other day as the sleepiest business owner. So any day that I have energy and productivity is a good and not necessarily guaranteed day.
Right. I think it shows maybe a lack of self-awareness that we both have our own businesses and yet we need a lot of sleep. But
You know, I find that it works great with my sleep schedule.
delusion is the answer.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be talking about whether you're an optimist or a pessimist.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think we've joked in previous episodes that I'm always like, oh yeah, that's me. And oh yeah, that's also me. And oh yeah, that's also me. I think for this one, I don't like, my instincts are that I don't really identify as either. So I think it'll be a slightly different conversation in which maybe I don't fully trauma and therapy dump on you, but we'll see. Plenty of time left.
I mean, no promises. I think that's interesting that you've gone from I am all the labels to like I am neither of these labels. So this will be good. Yeah, I like it. So let's just talk about defining these terms first, and then we'll start to get more into, okay, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? But an optimist, in the commonly accepted definition, is someone who generally expects positive outcomes and tends to focus on the brighter side of situations. And from like a psychological, clinical perspective, optimism is a mental attitude that's characterized by hope and confidence in success and a positive future. And it's often seen as a cognitive bias that influences how a person interprets events. So optimism is linked to positive thinking and what they call in psychology adaptive coping strategies, which is, I think we're going to get more into this as we talk about it, but I'm already hearing some bias in this definition, and that optimists are able to adapt to better. Maybe they're more resilient. So
Yeah.
And then for a pessimist, I'll read that one and then we'll talk about it. The commonly accepted definition is someone who expects negative outcomes and focuses on potential problems or challenges. And from a psychological standpoint, pessimism is the tendency to anticipate negative outcomes and view situations in a negative light. It's associated with maladaptive coping strategies, and it's often linked to increased anxiety and depression in extreme cases, but it can also be viewed as a cognitive bias where this person now focuses on the negative aspects of situations.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I identify with like different pieces of both of those like definitions, right? That like I would say I'm generally, I think, a positive person. We have talked about how I am potentially overconfident. Um, I, as I look at the world as a whole in my own future, I think I'm generally confident in my ability to move through hard stuff and to like figure out a way to navigate that and come out to a more or less positive result on the other side. But
Yeah.
also like I don't know, this being able to like anticipate things that are happening, like that could happen that are going to go wrong is like a big part of my anxiety. And also, I think what makes me effective at a lot of the work that I've done in the past, especially when it comes to more like project management or like event management work, like being able to kind of anticipate what could go wrong and plan ahead for that so that it doesn't go wrong, I think is not a maladaptive skill set. It is actually something that's like I can value in myself and that other people I think really value in me too.
Yeah. I mean, you have talked about in this series before, basically like assuming that everybody hates you and they're mad at you.
Sure.
And then that
Obviously.
causes you to, show up for people in a different way. And like,
Yeah.
is that pessimism or is it something else? I don't know. There's a lot of nuance to this.
Yeah, and I think it feels to me like this is I don't I'm like very curious as we like dive into voice notes because again, like these aren't labels that I identify. I think I can have like optimistic tendencies and I would lean more. If you
Mhm.
forced me into a bucket, I'm going to pick optimist, but I don't identify with that as a label. And I think in different moments and different
Yeah.
situations and different categories, I lean in one way more so than the other. And I have both of those aspects of who I am and how I approach things.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about it from a label standpoint, which is, the context of this whole series,
Uh-huh.
but, whatever. Um, I believe this is my lived experience of, I don't know, talking to humans for 40 plus years. I think there are many people who identify as an optimist, but there are very few people who would
Totally.
actually identify as a pessimist. And we'll get into this more as we go on, but in my work with Enneagram and understanding like different personality types, right? Like different talents that we bring to the world, I think people who might be labeled as a pessimist might see themselves as a pragmatist.
Yes. It's very funny that you say this because I've had a career coach that I've worked with off and on for like 7 or 8 years has labeled me as relentlessly practical. And I very much identify with that label.
So you're a practicalist, not a
Uh-huh.
pessimist or an optimist.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I, like, try and approach life in a very, like I definitely wanna, like, lean more positive and more joyful, and, like, those are things I would label and, like, identify myself with, which I don't think requires you to be optimistic.
Mhm.
But, yeah, I am very much, like, what's realistic? What do we like, what and I think that even, yeah, like, leads to my helps drive some of my optimism in some cases. Like my historic ability to move through hard things tells me that if the future brings other hard things, I can move through them and it'll be okay. Right. As opposed to just being like, everything's going to be fine. It's always fine. Like roses, unicorns, butterflies. Um, so yeah, I think I agree. I was like, I don't know anyone that labels themselves as a pessimist. Though I definitely have friends that I feel skew more in that direction if it's a spectrum than others. I would label them that way secretly.
Only in my head. Okay, well, let's dive into the first voice note because I think we have a lot of other things to unpack here.
Yeah.
I am definitely an optimist. I really do believe God is looking out for me and working all things for my good, even when things are hard. I've just seen too much in my life where I could not understand why something was happening that was terrible or negative. And in hindsight, I saw exactly why that thing happened, and it led to something good and amazing. I've just seen that happen too many times to be too pessimistic about anything. Not that I don't get down about stuff. Not that I don't have my negative days or get depressed, for sure, but I do feel like I'm an optimist just because I've seen God or the universe or whatever you believe in working in my life way too much to believe otherwise. So that's how that shows up.
Okay. So I am someone who is like admittedly very unreligious. So, when there's this phrase of like God has a plan, right? Of like, oh, everything just works out the way it's supposed to because there's a plan. So like I have some personal like conflict with that, but I think the idea of like faith in things working out, like, and in this particular voice note, like talking about the lived experience of like just when I thought things were terrible, like I see why it happened this way, or I see how things worked out in the end.
Yeah, it's funny. This was something I was thinking about as I was, quote, preparing for our conversation, that like I grew up in the South. I grew up in the Bible Belt, but not in a super religious family. We went to church occasionally. And I do think like religion can have this like beautiful like optimism built into it that I think is like very lovely, but also is not sort of how my brain works or how I approach this either. But at the same time, I also do have this like this almost mentality of like, I'm only given what I can handle. And like, I don't even have like an entity I don't know who's assigning that to me. But it's like, I've had a lot of like medical issues over my life. And I think those could really have weighed on me a lot more if I had like a different perspective just generally on those kinds of issues. And instead I will have this moment of like, well, it's fine that I had a broken foot that we couldn't really fix for 2 years and I still can't really run on it, because like being a marathon runner is not something that I ever wanted to do, and also didn't define me. So it's like okay that I had this thing happen to me because like I can handle it. And so, yeah, that's sort of my like kind of take on like not necessarily the backward looking, exactly like everything happens for a reason or there's a purpose for everything. But I do have this, my own kind of just like faith that like I can get through the bad stuff and that like I'm not being given anything that I can't handle and like work through.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about that because it's like, is it you're not going to be given anything you can't handle, or you can handle everything you're given? Like that feels very different
totally.
To me.
Yeah. It's so true. And I think a lot about like infertility and going through IVF for the last kind of year and a half, 2 years. And I was like, not surprised or fazed by the fact that we had to go through IVF. I was just like, sure, of course, fine. I didn't carry a lot of, I think, like the feelings of like shame or stigma or disappointment around that. But there was a point actually in the journey where like we went through a procedure. It was hard. It was unexpected. It was hard. And I was like, I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. Like, I do feel like I found the potential for a limit. But I think there's also was an element of choice there, right? And so it was like, it was a decision point of like, what am I willing to handle, right? Like if I have a choice in this matter, what am I willing to put myself through? Because like, this doesn't feel like a thing that I want to deal with. Like, I don't want this to be any harder and I don't want to have to work through these challenges. And, so yeah, that's not an answer to your question, but like it's an interesting moment where like something bad happened and like I was like, no, thank you. And I've also had my moments too of being like, oh, one more thing? Oh, really? Do you not think that I had enough? I feel like I had enough.
Right. Do we need to talk about this again? Because I'm finished. I'm done. I'm done with hardship.
Yeah, I think I've had more than my fair share. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think there's, well, and like in that definition, it was like this mental attitude that's characterized by hope and confidence in success and a positive future. Like, to me, that confidence, hope and confidence can very easily be the faith. You know, it can be
Totally.
very easily just be kind of like, I don't know, I've always had this innate, like, I don't know, call it like ignorant hopefulness, like, you know, and I just have always felt like I can figure out anything. And
Yeah.
that edges into optimism. It is confidence.
Yeah.
It's not like a bravado confidence. I feel like it's like this deep down, like, I'll figure it out. You know, I'm confident that I can figure things out.
Yeah. We're very competent people, right? Like I there's like a base level of competency that's what I'm leaning on with confidence. Like it's not unjustified. It's not like only forward looking or just blind hope. It's just like, no, historically I've been able to get through things. So I'll figure it out. Like I've always been able to figure it out.
Yeah. Like I have confidence in my competence and my resourcefulness.
Totally.
And so that's kind of like the internal optimism. But then one thing that was really interesting that I didn't even really, I hadn't seen myself in this way, but like during 2020, when the world was falling apart and, you know, we had COVID and lockdown and racial reckoning and Trump running for president for a second term, right? Like it seemed like everything was terrible.
Yeah.
And I had so many friends that were coming to me to say, like, tell me it's going to be okay. Like they wanted to, like, by osmosis, like pick up some of my hopefulness. And
so interesting.
It was really interesting because I had never labeled myself an optimist. I never thought about myself that. And I'm not a rainbows and unicorns kind of person. Like I do also feel the same. I'm very practical. I'm a realist. I'm like I'll plan for things. And yet when the world was like, our country was at its darkest moment and people were freaking out, they were like asking me to share some of my optimism with them, I guess. And so it kind of changed the way I saw myself.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing about like these labels in particular feel like I think more about how I categorize people in these positions and how other people might categorize me more so than a lot of the other things we talked about previously, or how I label myself and how I think about myself. And so I do think that that's like this particular, at least this optimism or pessimism spectrum feels very influenced by how other people like perceive you and react to you and what they come to you for. Meanwhile, I was the person who told everyone we were going to be in lockdown for 18 months in March and no one believed me. But that's what the data said.
You were relentlessly practical. That was real. Meanwhile, a friend of mine and I were making reservations online at like some of the like impossible places to make a reservation for dinner. We made a bunch of dinner reservations for May of 2020. So,
okay.
Like,
because we're like on the 2-week mark. Good job.
No, it was mostly her. Because she's like, it's going to be fine in May. And then we're going to be like geniuses that now have all these amazing dinner reservations, right? And so it was
I love that still.
When May came and went and we were like, yeah, I think we can cancel these. So we were not on the 18-month train.
Yeah.
However, as it went on, I was like, you know, it's going to be okay. I think the election's going to be fine. I think this is going to be, you know, like.
Yeah.
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 I don't know. Okay, let's listen to another voice note.
Yeah.
I think we have one pessimist in the group. And now I have not heard these, which is how we always do these episodes. But all right, here's the second one.
Oh my goodness. Good question. Pessimist or optimist? I feel like everybody's going to want to say they're an optimist. I probably have a nuanced answer here, and that is my knee-jerk is pessimist because I am like anxiously overanalyzing every potential outcome to make sure I'm prepared. So some people in my life, a best friend named Sandhya included, might have given me a nickname of Doomsday Lex precisely for this reason. And I would share two things. One, I will say that having a more immediate pessimistic outlook has allowed me to be prepared, albeit sometimes over-prepared for things. So, right, like having a plan A, a plan B, a plan C. Being able to kind of see what's around the corner and think ahead proactively. And it's also forced me to learn how to get my head in an optimistic state, because a pessimist isn't super inspiring to be around. And so I've trained myself, as soon as I feel my brain going into the what if, and what could go wrong, I can pull myself back out and then focus on the silver lining. So much so that actually I had some really healthy feedback from my current team, which I appreciated, which is, Alexa, love that you are trying to show us the silver lining on everything, but sometimes you jump to the silver lining too quickly. And sometimes, you know, my team or my partners around me, my children, frankly, they might just appreciate being able to sit with the disappointment or sit with a frustration before immediately diving into, well, and here's why it's going to be a good thing, or here's how we can reframe it, right? So net, pessimistic by default, trained on finding the optimism and still learning how to appropriately balance acknowledging that things are hard or that things can go wrong and it's disappointing, before then making the turn to reframing for optimism. So hope that helps.
Okay, well, I appreciate the honesty in this one. These have typically been anonymous. However, she gave herself up, so I can say that is my best friend, Alexa. And when we were in our 20s and 30s, like, we traveled the world together. Like, we would take like a 2-week trip almost every year, take 2 weeks off of work and go to South Africa or go to South America or go to Morocco or go to wherever. And in our functions on this trip planning, you've already heard this from me, I would find the hotels because I'm a bathroom snob and I have very high standards when it comes to accommodations. It's not like the fanciest, most expensive place. It's like very specific things that I require. And guess what she would do? She would look up what vaccinations that we needed. She would go to the pharmacy and get all the potential medicines of anything that might happen. She would have like an entire pharmacy in her bag for the stomach bugs, for the this, the that, the whatever. She would like call the embassy. This was like back in the, early 2000s, whatever. She'd like call the embassies to tell them we were going to be in the country. Like, she had our doomsday plans covered, which is why many of us affectionately refer to her as Doomsday Alexa. And so she earned that name. However, it was helpful to have these contingencies.
Yeah. Well, and this probably, I was going to say famously, but I'm probably the only one that remembers this. But I like famously did not go on a spring break trip with my friends in college because I did not trust that nothing would go wrong and that I would exhaust myself trying to like take care of everyone and making sure no one was taking unnecessary risks. I was like, I can't do that. That sounds very stressful. I will not have a good time.
Was this like a dangerous location? What was happening?
No, I mean, it was just like Cabo, but I just like didn't. I just didn't try, like, literally, it was, well, also the weekend I decided this was after, like, in our very safe college campus in, like, the middle of nowhere, one friend, like, ran off into the forest and I lost another one somewhere. So I'm like, if I can't keep track of you on the campus where I know everyone, I'm not keeping track of you in a foreign country. So yeah, I would love to travel with her. That sounds like a delight.
And so it was both the combination of some things probably go wrong because, by the way, I have evidence of these people and things going wrong with these people, and I'm going to be the one that has to figure out how to like get it all together that caused you to exclude yourself from this trip.
Yeah, exactly. But I love too this like, I don't know, this idea of like silver light, like I just such interesting like self-awareness too, right? To like incorporated this kind of practice of realizing I'm not trying to like bring everyone down. Again, like how does this label and this like personality trait or whatever you want to call it, like impact other people and like trying to adapt, right? To like have this more kind of positive impact on people. And I could also see and like very much relate to the like overcorrecting kind of on the silver lining that I think like I have a resource I'll share later, but just this like this quote is like optimism, like most things, has its limits. And when it doesn't, it tilts into like delusion or like even can endanger people. And examples are like, women in abusive relationships are maybe encouraged to stay with a person hurting them. And this optimistic, like, oh, things will get better. Like he's not all bad, or you can help him change. And I think you can see that in more minor things too, the more abusive relationships that like, someone just like spends a little too much money or like, has a few bad habits. It's like, oh, it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. And like, I saw that a lot in like IVF, and that like, you're like, oh, it only takes one embryo. Like you're meant to have a kid. It'll work out. And it's like, well, we don't know that. And like, that's great. Let's be positive. Like I tried to maintain a positive attitude throughout the whole thing, but they're always with this like dose of realism of like, we're trying this next thing. It might work. It might not. The next thing, same thing. And I think when we do like stray too much into optimism, it has this like rose-colored glasses, like lack of connection to reality that can, in the same way that being maybe like a negative Nancy might really pull people down, can also be this real turnoff.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you used the term that I like jotted down on the side to myself, which was overcorrection. I think that I see this in a lot of the, especially female leaders that I work with, in many different ways, where like they may have been told at some point in their career that they're too direct. And so now they like fluff up everything they want to say. Or for her, like she was told like she's too negative. So then she's like, let me put a positive spin on everything.
Yeah.
And then what happens is what she mentioned with, her team or her kids, or like what you just said is throwing glitter on top of something that somebody just like needs to be heard. And sometimes they want to share their feelings, or they need you to be in this like difficult place with them instead of being like, it's gonna be great. I mean, the embryo thing, it's like finding a partner is the same, right? Like,
oh my God, yes.
Like, the dating pool is full of sludge right now. And yet, there are people who are like, it just takes one, like you only have to find one person. And it's like, yes. And like, just let me be annoyed right now, So
yes.
I think it's the idea of like, not invalidating, but like brushing over or brushing past somebody's like real experience of something they need to vent about or be heard, or like have you just hold space for, and throwing optimism at it is like not helpful.
Yeah. It's again, I think it's like, I don't know. The way that I think about it is like, there's like, the value isn't about like, correct, like trying to be really optimistic or trying to be really pessimistic, thinking about everything that can go wrong versus thinking about everything can go right. Like I think it's it's a balance, right? And like finding, like, to me, the way that I think about it is like starting from this place of just being honest, right? Like this deadline is really tight, right? If we're talking about a team thing and we have a lot to get done, we are going to do our best to get as much done as we can and make this as good as possible. But like some things might go wrong, some things might slip through the cracks. But I think that like, I think that we can have like a good showing, a good event or whatever, like in the end, right? And I think that's what people, I think in teams in particular, but in other aspects of our life is like, I think it's just that it is that, I think, honesty and realism. And maybe there is the room for this, like, I don't mean veneer as in like a false or superficial thing. I think there's a tone and like a vibe that can be more positive that you put on it. But I think rooting things in like what's realistic and practical feels the most beneficial to people, but also that's just my nature. So maybe I'm biased.
Well, the word that came up when you were saying that for me is being solutions oriented, which again, I think this is like one of those like management tropes that's like taken on a life of its own, not a good way, is like when a manager says like, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. And again, it like, while I understand that there was this intention behind that at one point, which is like, I want to enable you. I want you to feel a sense of autonomy. I want you to think through it and what's going wrong and how could you solve it on your own and those kinds of things. Well, I think that's good and helpful. What it's turned into is this like very carte blanche, like blanket statement of like, I don't ever want to hear you complain, or I don't ever want to hear you bring up problems. And like that actually in and of itself is like counter to building a psychologically safe culture.
Right.
So it goes back to this, like, you need to be heard sometimes, you know, like maybe you don't have access to the solution or the resources or the knowledge or the whatever to get there. And so like, can we have a code word when it's like, I hear you. I know you want solutions, but like, I need to talk about a problem.
Right. And also like, I don't know, we have managers and like hierarchy, like presumably we're getting paid more at the top levels to help solve problems too. And not like, if not just wait for everyone at the bottom to solve everything. That like, yes, I do want you to be proactive and to come up with some ideas. But it is also the job as you move up within an organization to figure out how to solve these big issues too, or in some cases, just listen.
Yeah. Like the idea is like, instead of just having this like very high level phrase, it's like, can we give it some nuance? Can we say like, I want you to think about what might be in your control that might be a solution to this. And if this is way out of your scope, like bring me the problem. Let's talk about it. Let's unpack it. Let's figure it out together.
Yeah. I have been helping out with just volunteering at a friend who's running some events every once in a while. And the thing is like, you all, these volunteers, you are the solution to any problem that comes up. And I think it's meant as this very positive thing. And I just my heart rate I should look at my like phone stats. I just feel like I'm like, oh God, what if I can't solve the problem? Like that's the pessimist inside of me. I forget everything I've said about being competent, capable, and resourceful. And I'm just like, what if I can't solve the problem? Everyone will be disappointed.
Which then puts you into a state where you're probably not doing your best thinking, right?
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about some of the behaviors and kind of like the positive and maybe the drawback. So for pessimists, it's that, you know, pessimists often take a more cautious or defensive approach. Maybe they expect negative outcomes. Maybe they prepare for worst case scenarios, which is something that our last voice noter mentioned for sure. They may avoid risks. They may show higher levels of anxiety about future events. And pessimists can be more realistic. They can be more effective at planning for or avoiding potential problems. This defensive pessimism can lead to better decision-making in high-stakes situations where optimism might cause people to overlook important risks. That's kind of that practicality piece.
Yeah, I think we talked about this in a previous episode, but I used to work in a comms agency, and on a particular project, we ended every meeting with Arden's list of concerns. And it was a list of just things I thought could go wrong, right? Like on the client side, on our side, me personally, whatever. And I was just like, here are all the things that I think could go wrong. Do we need a plan for these things? Maybe we don't, but here are the things that are like keeping me up at night.
Yeah, right. And so like being able to project into the future to see those things and like mitigate those risks is very important.
Yeah. And it's like so funny too, like coming off of a wedding this weekend and just, you know, having some judgment around the way some things were organized and planned and what we prioritized and did not prioritize. And like none of it mattered. I actually think that the team did a really good job and chose to prioritize the right things. But there are some things that I know I would have planned for differently because of this, like, because I'm always sort of like thinking of like, what's the like possible tree of all of the outcomes that could come from these things. And, in a wedding with 250 people, like what could go wrong?
Right. Lots of things. So then behaviorally, optimists, they tend to take risks more readily, show resilience in the face of challenges, and often persist longer in the pursuit of goals, this is interesting. I mean, granted, this is research from the internet, but they often expect the best outcome and are more likely to engage in proactive problem solving. Optimists are more likely to cope better with stress and have stronger social connections, which is interesting. Now, optimism or unrealistic optimism can lead to poor decision making. It can lead to risk taking where maybe risks are not good and underestimating dangers. So, over optimism may lead to disappointment if the outcomes don't match the expectations.
Yeah, I read something too around like the role of privilege in optimism, that people that are more likely to identify as optimistic, their life is easier for a variety of reasons, right? And so like I think I became someone who took more risks when I felt like I had a stronger financial safety net than I did growing up, right? And that's, again, less about optimism and much more about the reality of if this doesn't go well, it's okay, right? Like I am accurately understanding the risks and the dangers because I know what it's like to not have this particular aspect of my life that's maybe sort of easier and more comfortable. And I do think that, like, especially when we talk about risks, there is like, I believe that there are people that are more risk averse and more risk excited. But I also think that privilege plays a real role in our ability to say yes and have the consequences of those risks be less dramatic.
So true. Like I would say that I'm lower on the risk aversion scale. So I'm more open to risks. However, also I quit my job with nothing else lined up and I started my own business largely because I had a financial safety net that was called my corporate savings and my 401k and my, all of these things, right? So it's much easier to be quote unquote optimistic or brave if you have some layers of privilege working for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me too, in this decision to like leave my job, it's like the partner privilege of it too. Like having the benefit, like we had a shared safety net. I played a big role in creating that, but also we have as benefits to lean on. We have this secondary income, and that, when people will, I don't know if you get people will talk about, how brave you are to go out on your own. And it's like, I was able to. Like yes, it was risky and scary, and that's still true. And also the risk was not as great as it is for other people because of these privileges.
Totally. Okay, let's listen to another voice note. We've got 2 more.
Hi. I am absolutely an optimist. And it shows up in my life that I'm definitely a morning person. I wake up every day feeling like something new could come into my life and change it. And I think that shows up in my personal relationships, and that I get really excited for people. I like sharing joy with them. And I always assume the best. I think in my work, how being an optimist shows up is that I, again, assume the best in all my team dynamics. I think it's one of the main reasons that I'm a collaborative negotiator and leader. And I think it also feeds into my leadership style, that I'd much prefer for us to have the win than for it to be anywhere close to about me, because I think the optimistic person, or the trait in me, sees it that we should all be winning. And I really do believe that everyone put their best efforts forward.
What a wonderful way to start your day.
I know. Oh my gosh. Like thinking about like the amazing things that could happen today. Like, gosh, I do love my sleep, but I do think I'm a morning person. However, I think I call myself that because my brain functions the best in the morning because it's like fresh and I can think and I have all these ideas. You're like, nope.
It's not me. I believe that that's you.
Yeah.
I'm disagreeing with your personal assessment.
No, I know. You're like, it's definitely not me. Like I can see you like, I am not that way. But like to think about starting your day with like what's possible.
It's amazing.
That's amazing.
I feel like that's that's a great, like, I do want that next to optimism. Like, I want that to be the definition. Like, that really feels like, I think, and also why I don't feel like I would identify as an optimist. Like, I don't think that, like, that is this just like, this just incredibly like positive way, but also without going into that like to me, like super unrealistic, impossible, unjustified territory. It's like being really open, right? And like welcoming of good things happening. It's like manifesting, which I don't really do, except I just think things will work out generally.
Yeah, but it does remind me of like having a gratitude practice, right? I think there's these in manifestation, in the people that are experts on it, kind of like talk about it working the same way, where it's like if you think positive thoughts, like if you recognize what's good in your life, like you kind of like have a different energy you put into the world. It's not like magic, right? It's like, oh, I'm constantly thinking about what's amazing about my life. Then that like attracts people to you. It like your energy is contagious. Like people want, and then you have more opportunities and like it kind of like cycles into this virtual cycle kind of thing. And so I think that's like a really great, interesting tie into like gratitude, but also just like a really great practice in the morning.
Yeah. And I liked what she was sharing too around like assuming the best. I think the way that I kind of phrase that in my own life is like the benefit of the doubt. Again, so like maybe a little less positive, a little more rooted in practicality, but like definitely never assuming the worst, right? Like really assuming like fairly good intentions, assuming if a mistake is made that it was an accident, that this person, and like not being like, well, this is a careless person, right? Like not sort of like pushing out these making big sweeping brushes around what I think about someone based on sort of one behavior or one action. And it's something that's deeply important, I would say, to me in terms of how I want people to interact with me, that like I do want people to assume the best. And it's when I get, I think the most defensive is when I feel like people haven't done that for me.
Yeah, totally. I think the phrase of assume positive intent, right, is like something just relationally that's important. It helps us get around our like cognitive biases that we might have around like judgments that we might hold about people if we actually like start with that good intention. And one of the things in this research that I thought was interesting was it talked about like a key indicator in whether you're an optimist or a pessimist being how do you explain good and bad events. And it says optimists tend to view bad events as like temporary and specific, but they tend to view good events as more stable and global. And pessimists do the opposite, where they see bad events almost as like permanent and widespread, and the good events are like isolated or like because of luck. So it's kind of like, where do you frame neutral?
Yeah.
What's the exception to the rule? Is it the good things that happen or the bad things that happen?
So interesting. I think for me it's like the exceptions are more often the bad things, but I think I still have categories where it kind of flips, that I will even with this benefit of the doubt thing, I will take like one sort of I don't know, maybe a habit of a bad behavior. Like I think about, there are people from high school that I think were terrible people that I assume are still terrible people today. I do not I have no room in my heart for them having changed to become kind people.
Who hurt you, Arden?
I know. And then I think there are like broader systems. Like I'm working with a client right now on a project around how lower income tax filers experience the tax filing system. Unsurprisingly, complicated, scary, all of that stuff. But something interesting that came up when interviewing folks is that a lot of these people, when asked like what would help them feel more financially secure, usually turn to like, well, I could do this better, I could do this better, I could do this better. But the fact is they're already doing a lot of those things. They're already being careful with their spending. They already understand not to take out high interest debt. They're already working a lot. And the reality is that it's a systems issue, right? And so it's like, in that case, it's like the bad thing is the rule and not about the person, but about the system. And so I still feel like there's, for me, right, it's like hard to very much be like, I'm definitely in one of these categories, though I think I lean more to the optimist end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I think there's that recognition that like systems are designed certain ways to like disadvantage people, like is the truth. That's not being a pessimist. It's like,
right,
again, being a realist and like seeing that and seeing the lack of privilege or how our financial systems or our health systems aren't there really to like help people as much as serve the interests of the people who created them.
Right. And then I think it's so much more right about like pattern recognition, and again, grounded in practicality and pragmatism, than it is about sort of taking like a positive or negative lens to something.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's listen to our fourth and final voice note.
I choose the label of optimist for myself because to me it means seeing the good or the opportunity in everything. And perhaps it's a coping mechanism, but time and time again, when things don't go my way or they do, I choose to see the goodness and know that there's opportunity if I can rise to the occasion. I make sure to give myself room to be sad or angry, but I always come back to the silver lining because it gives me strength. And I think a positive attitude manifests in more ways than one, and I really like to lean into that through my optimism.
Yeah, I think this is kind of like what we were talking about of like, if I stay believing that good things are happening, then like good things are going to happen more often. You know?
Yeah. And well, and I can really relate to that, like the coping mechanism of things like when things don't go well, I am also someone that's like, okay, what's the silver lining, right? Like, okay, we did IVF. We did not get as many embryos as we wanted. But that tells me that it was good that we did IVF, because if not, we would have been just doing this naturally once a month, and that probably wouldn't have worked out. So it's very good that we did. This is now proof that we made the right choice, right? Like it's just like finding, I like that idea, that coping kind of like language in particular, I think I can really relate to, because it is very much my like, yes, I'll let myself dwell in something being bad for a little while, but then like, what's next? Like, how do we move forward from this? Not that I necessarily think there's something positive to take from everything, but I'm certainly going to look for it.
Yeah. I think one of the things that she talked about there is positive thinking being a source of strength. And I know one of the things that you were going to recommend is a book about resilience.
Yeah, which I haven't read, of course. But I've read an interview about it.
It's called The Resilience Myth. I'm just looking at this now and I'm like, well, maybe that actually was the opposite of like talking about strength. So
No, I think that it's like I think it's right in that like the positivity can be a strength, but so can like pessimism, right? We talked at the beginning, very few people are going to label themselves as a pessimist. And so this is like, you'll share the link in the show notes, but this is just like a Q&A of this book written by Soraya Chumali. And I read an interview with her that was done by Anne Helen Peterson for her Substack Culture Study, which I really like. And she shares a lot of great insights. It's mostly, again, her book is called The Resilience Myth. So it's focused on resilience. But the kind of last question in this article is the role of optimism and resilience. And I just really liked her answer, which is that my conclusion is that what we should be focusing on is cognitive flexibility. Resilient people tend to apply optimism and pessimism strategically and pragmatically. Pessimism allows us to assess risks more accurately, plan ahead to avoid them, and adapt more quickly and effectively. But you will rarely, if ever, hear someone tell another person, especially a child, learn to be a pessimist. The point is, we need to use both.
Yeah. Okay. So that is a great segue into one of the points that I think is really important to make here. And when I was reading some of these definitions, there's some stuff that I, hadn't read in the course of this recording, but it was very clear that there was some bias around optimism being a good thing and pessimism being a bad thing. And a lot of the things, and even in some of what I did read was, people who are optimistic deal with stress well, and they handle challenges, and they bounce back, and they take action, and they do all this stuff. And pessimistic people dwell and toil mentally and all emotionally and all these things. And I was like, I actually don't believe that. Now, maybe in like a psychological definition or something like that, but like the way that we use it in normal life, I actually think the action piece of it is not exclusive to optimists. It's if you are a pessimist, or if you see the risks, and this is like Enneagram type 6 is like the classic kind of like pessimist, like they are the risk mitigators. They project out into the future. They say, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? It's the scenario A, B, C, D, E, F, G. I will have contingencies for all of them. And they take action against those to prepare. Now, I think there's a line that we can cross to say, like, am I over preparing, right? Am I over worrying, over preparing? Like, where is my line where I'm going from like doing this with a sense of agency? I'm using my talent to understand the risks and using my preparedness to figure out what to do, into like, we go into patterned personality mode, right? Where it's a little more like we're in a reactive state and we're like, going off of going down a rabbit hole. But the action part, you can be a pessimist and take plenty of practical action.
Yeah. And I think I was sharing, I've like heard Jane Fonda on a podcast this weekend talking about optimism versus hope. And the way that she defined it, I just think is like an interesting other perspective of like optimism can actually be incredibly inactive, right? You're just like, things will work out. It'll be fine. But if you're not like relying on yourself or like figuring out how it's actually going to be fine, then like nothing changes, right? Yeah. For her, she kind of describes hope as like a muscle. It requires strengthening. It requires action. We should have that instead. And I do think, especially politically, you see this a lot. And I'll just say, as a very white lady among white people, that like everything's going to be fine, right? Like we'll elect the right person. We will address the financial climate, healthcare, whatever the challenges are. Things will get better. Things always move in a better direction. And the truth is that like it requires effort from all of us to actually make that true. And if we just kind of take a back seat on optimism of everything works out, and that's the approach, which isn't how anyone today has described themselves, but like optimism actually becomes the fairly sort of inactive label.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the idea of practical action is like where either of those two camps can meet in like in reality. And, like it can't all just be like everything's going to be fine, and it can't all just be everything's going to be terrible. It's got to be, okay, what are we going to do about this? Or how are we going to move forward? And I think that's the important piece. And I mentioned the Enneagram 6 is like the kind of classic pessimist. The Enneagram 7 is the classic optimist. They are the positive reframers, find the silver lining, like everything's going to be great. There's always another idea or option or possibility. And what I find to be so interesting is like on teams, when I'm working with people, these are the two types that like butt heads the most, because it's like the type 6 is like, there's a real risk here. I want to be heard. I want you to take me seriously. And the type 7's like, why are you yucking my yum? Like, why are you bursting my bubble and bringing us down? And I want to be fun and creative and in this space. And so like those two types can really have a lot of tension. And it's like the funniest thing. So I'm like, if you all could just work together, you could have brilliant ideas and mitigate the risks around them.
Yeah.
But instead, you want to say like the other one is like impractical or negative, you know? And it's like,
right.
But you make the perfect pair.
Yeah. We need both.
We totally need both. Okay. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. We'll link the book that you mentioned in the show notes and the Q&A if there's a link to that too. And we'll be back with one more episode about labels.
See you soon.